I would like to call tonight's meeting of the Tacoma Park City Council to order. Would the clerk please call the roll?
Mayor Searcy.
Here.
Councilmember Fulcher.
Present.
Councilmember Dubala.
Present.
Councilmember Gibson.
Here.
Councilmember Siemens.
Present.
Councilmember Hanzak.
Present.
Councilmember Small.
Rock on.
All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us on a Monday. It's a bit of a special meeting for us, and we will have a couple of special Monday sessions over the next couple of weeks. We're we're meeting this evening as a number of us will be traveling for the National League of Cities Conference that will take place starting on Wednesday. And then next week we'll be meeting on Monday because of the Thanksgiving holiday. So thank you all for your willingness and flexibility as we are working through competing events. So with that, I'm going to go through what we're going to talk about on the agenda today, and then I'll run through the schedule for the next few upcoming sessions. So today we're going to have, there are no voting items, but we will have a series of presentations. The first will be the annual comprehensive financial report and audit that will be presented by our consultants. The second item is the police pension plan actuarial valuation. And then the last presentation will be the final report on the long-term financial forecast. In terms of our next meetings, just again as a reminder, on Wednesday, November the 15th, we will not be meeting, again, as folks will be traveling for the National League of Cities Conference. On Monday, November the 20th, we actually do have, and I just want to make sure that the city clerk can confirm the Montgomery County Planning.
That's correct. They are available that night.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So fingers crossed, barring I'm not continuing to be jinxed, but Montgomery Planning presentation will happen on Monday on the county development review process. We will also have a presentation on the from the city manager, the FY25 budget forecast. We will also have, just going to triple check one thing because I don't see something on the agenda for tonight. Okay. Yes. So there's also a tentative session on regarding the use of housing reserve funds for the Garland Avenue project, and that's a tentative voting session. And we will have two work sessions. One is an update on the city manager search, and the second is the city council FY25 budget priorities. Just again, as a reminder, on Wednesday, November the 22nd, the council will not meet. And on Thursday, November the 23rd, is Thanksgiving Day. City offices and facilities are closed Thursday through Sunday for the Thanksgiving holiday. On Wednesday, November the 25th, the council will meet at its regular time of 7:30, and we will have a series of voting items. The first is a resolution adopting the FY25 budget priorities and potential tax rate goals, a resolution adopting the public space management plan, as well as tentatively a second reading ordinance regarding the use of the housing reserve funds for Garland Avenue. We will have two work sessions that evening. One is a development of the Balancing Act survey for community release, and the second is an update on the minor master plan amendment planning board work sessions. And that will take us into December. And just as a quick reminder, on Wednesday, December the 6th, the City Council will be meeting with our District 20 delegation to discuss joint priorities. The meeting is currently slated for 7 p.m., but it may begin at 7:30, so I just want to encourage folks to be on the lookout for any updates in terms of the schedule. And so with that,
7:30 or 6:30? I thought you said it
I'm
was going to
sorry,
maybe
did I
go
say
up.
6:30? It's 7 p.m., but it may
Yes.
go up to 6:30.
Solid. All right.
Thank you, I apologize, I said 7:30. And that is for December the 6th, for those that are following along. All right, so with that, we're going to move on to public comments. Again, we don't have any voting items for this evening, so if you have any general public comments, feel free to come to the mic.
Thank you, Mayor Searcy, members of the council. Linda Pence Gunter, Tacoma Park. 40 years ago, on December 15th, Tacoma Park became one of the first cities in the US to declare itself a nuclear-free zone. Tacoma Park was also one of the first cities to become a member of Mayors for Peace, established in 1982 by the mayor of Hiroshima. And Tacoma Park was also the very first city in the US to declare its compliance with the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, known as the TPNW. For this latter, Tacoma Park was given a special award, and I therefore commend Mayor Searcy for joining 200+ other officials from around the country in signing Back from the Brink's letter to President Biden, urging him to, 1, send an observer delegation to the forthcoming TPNW meeting at the UN, and 2, initiate negotiations with all nuclear weapon states on eliminating nuclear weapons from the planet. However, the city's Nuclear-Free Zone Act was considered the gold standard principally because it included a citizen committee of advisors who ensured the city's compliance and helped create events that boosted Tacoma Park's reputation worldwide as a leader on nuclear disarmament and peace. That nuclear-free Tacoma Park committee has now been abolished in a frankly shameful, unanimous vote by this council. I have brought with me the close to 700 names who signed a petition decrying your decision to cut off democratic citizen engagement in this way on such a crucially topical issue. The signatories include not only citizens of Tacoma Park, but leaders in the worldwide nuclear abolition movement, including representatives of 2 Nobel Peace Prize winning groups. A 40-year nuclear-free anniversary event, now cancelled, had been planned by the abolished committee. However, in doing away with the committee, the council reassured us that its task could easily be reassigned to city staff. Please let us know, therefore, what the city has planned to mark this important 40th anniversary and to continue to promote Tacoma Park's nuclear-free status. Now, you might suggest that citizens of Tacoma Park could organize a commemorative event themselves, but this would entirely lack the official city imprimatur, a significant and important statement. Finally, we are still waiting to learn what actions the city attorney will take or has already taken regarding the remit he was given by the council to effectively edit the nuclear-free code. I look forward to the answers to these questions. As nuclear Russia continues to wage war in Ukraine, as nuclear Israel bombards Gaza, and with a US nuclear-armed submarine stationed in Middle Eastern waters, the nuclear-free message has never been more urgent. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any other general public comments?
Tom Gagliardo, 107 Hodges Lane, Ward 1. I signed the petition that my neighbor referred to. I don't understand when people are willing to do something why you would discourage them from doing it. I'm here tonight to share with you, the mayor and council, and to share with the community at large the news that the founding publisher and editor of the Tacoma Voice, Lou DeSabla, passed away on Friday. Excuse my emotion. He was a good friend of mine. It's good to acknowledge our common humanity and to console Lou's family and friends. However, I'm sharing this with you because it is important to learn from our shared history, to learn from our past mistakes, and to be guided by the best contributions of, to use a hackneyed phrase, those on whose shoulders we stand. Lou made many contributions to the welfare and benefit of the residents of our city. Lou understood the importance of communicating both hard news and informed opinion with our community. He knew that good journalism is a fundamental element of democratic governance. His contributions to protecting and advancing the needs of all of us in Tacoma Park should not go unrecognized. May we all embrace the importance of public forums like the Tacoma Voice. May Lou DeSabla rest in peace, and his memory be a blessing.
Thank you so much, Tom, for your kind words. Do we have any other general public comments today?
Hello, my name's Jimmy. I live on 1119 Lancaster Road. I'm kind of nervous, that's why I'm smiling. That's like what I do when I'm nervous. But anyway, today I'm here to talk about the rec center. Lots of times when I go there to play basketball, there's always a lot of people there and only a little bit of space. And since there's aftercare and high schoolers and middle schoolers all in one court gym, it gets pretty packed in there sometimes. This lots of times has resulted in people getting hurt, and especially kids from the aftercare that happens there. And I think just today, since the football season ended, a lot of people of the high schoolers that were playing football for Blair came to the gym today, and there was like 30 high schoolers all in one gym. And it was really packed, and the high schoolers were getting pretty mad because everybody kept getting in their way and stuff. And I think we might benefit if we can get a bigger rec center, because then much more people would go there, I'm sure, and everybody would be happier that they have enough space to have fun and do what they'd like.
Thank you very much for your comments this evening. Do we have any other general public comments? Okay. Do we have any virtual comments?
No, we have no one who's signed up on time.
Okay, great. All right, so do we have any council comments?
Virtual comment.
Oh.
Why are
What?
Yeah, I signed up in time. I wanted to ask
All right,
about the
we
Jews.
might be getting
Hello?
zone bombed. Okay.
Okay,
All right,
so we're supposed to know what's going on with
let's
our
start with
public
Councilmember
meetings,
Gibson.
and when we sign up and you guys
Well,
don't
first
let
of
us
all,
speak,
to-
this is what
yeah.
you get. This is called civil
Jimmy,
disobedience.
thanks for your
Okay.
comments, and
The ADL
Tom,
is going to shut down this
I
meeting.
didn't
This
know
meeting
Lou, but,
is being
I
shut
wanna
down by
learn
the ADL.
more about him. And then lastly, I do consider the efforts made by the Nuclear Freeze Committee pretty important, and I appreciate the petition. I certainly will look at it. And then lastly, I just wanted to remind folks that the ongoing saga of the minor master plan continues. A work session is scheduled this Thursday at approximately between 5 or 6 o'clock. The time is not exact, and I appreciate everyone's attention to that work session, and look forward to watching it myself. Thank you.
Councilmember Small.
Thank you, man. First of all, that's my boy. Yay. Good for you. Nice work. Jimmy is working on being confident enough to say what his opinion is in public, and one of the difficulties about that is if you have a dad that doesn't mind doing that, then you have some inherent embarrassment about speaking in public. So I'm actually really proud of him for being in here today. Additionally, I did want to sort of talk about that tangentially, but I do have an announcement that for the good people of the ward, that there has been some advocacy back and forth between the mayor and the city manager and the public works staff, and there's going to be an additional trash service. By now, it should be on the listserv for the people who need to be contacted electronically. But I will also make sure I walk around and knock on some doors with some people who may or may not know. I sincerely appreciate the aspects of working internally within the government to make some things like that happen, and I thank all of you who did it. That kind of leads to the next part of this, because I am supremely happy that the mayor is a signatory on that letter. And I am also happy that I believe we all got it as council members, I think. I was willing to sign it, but candidly, I don't always know what is legal and not legal, or kosher and not kosher for us to do as council people. So I try to defer to the mayor on those kinds of things. And so I did want to say publicly that from a policy perspective, like, we got to stop bombing everybody. So I am with you on that. Whether or not we should have review over contracts at this stage in life or whatever is a separate issue to me. That being said, somewhere in the nexus between politics and policy and the administrative aspects of the government, there are longer-term problems that are alienating to people, and there are short-term problems that are kind of like stubbing your toe. And so it's difficult for me as a person who is sat with long-term issues to get as worked up about short-term melodrama. Because when the boy was born, the rec center needed to be built. And by that point, like, I had already thought, man, we should have rec center. We can't even hoop around here, really. And we have legacies about these kinds of things, and we have to address them.
Thank you, Councilmember Small. Councilmember Fulcher?
I wanted to congratulate Blair's soccer team, the girls' soccer team, and this is from the point of view of someone who knows nothing about sports. I just understand from what I'm reading in the Washington Post that they're qualifying for their first state final in program history, which is a big deal. And I do think that our community has something to do with that. A lot of those Blair girls soccer players grew up in the Tacoma Park soccer program, and creating a space for female identifying soccer players to have a safe space to grow together as soccer players really matters, because if you're on a co-ed team, you do sometimes reach a point where the boys aren't passing to the girls as much as they used to. And so I really appreciate that we create these female spaces, female identifying spaces in Tacoma Park. And I also really appreciate all of the individual efforts and hard work, because there's a lot of that involved. And then I want to congratulate especially Camille Aliaga, our Summer Rise student, as part of that soccer team. So congratulations to all those girls working hard.
Councilmember Siemens?
Thank you, Mayor. And I just wanted to take a minute to thank Councilmember Fulcher and Councilmember Gibson for their help today at delivering food packages to residents in Ward 4. I especially wanted to thank Councilmember Fulcher for coordinating with the Girl Scouts to provide Thanksgiving gift to the residents. They prepared cups for them and gave them a little package of sweet tea and chocolate, hot chocolate. So thank you very much to both of you, and also to the other residents who helped distribute that food. It was a challenging day with trucks showing up later than expected, but we got it done, and I think everybody's happy. Certainly the residents are.
Councilmember Hontak?
Thank you. I'm not going to repeat all the comments that my colleagues have made, but among them, I am very grateful for the public comments tonight, and I want to echo my Councilmember Small's statement that he made about I'm really glad that the mayor signed on to the letter. I was not sure what we should do as individual council members. A few other issues have come before us like this, and there's only so much time in a week, particularly when it's a short week like this one coming into our next meeting when we get to connect again. So, and that Jimmy really inspired me. I hope he inspired all the youth across the city today. I think the two biggest pieces of news are I am really excited and elated that so many folks on this council and county council members showed up for the COMA Healing Practice and Dynamic Choice Salon grand openings. That was a really big deal for Ward 5. We've been so anxious to get these business spaces filled and with dynamic local businesses. It's really incredibly exciting. In fact, the owners of all three of those businesses are right here from Tacoma Park, so it's pretty neat. And on that note, the owner of Dynamic Choice Hair Salon has very generously offered her space for our community to gather, which is something that my community has been begging for. We've been trying to find some place that we could gather regularly, and we are going to start having a monthly meeting. I hope, unless something goes wrong, we haven't done it yet. The first one will be December 3rd from 3 to 5 at Dynamic Choice Hair Salon. So I just want to shout out a huge thank you to Cindy Dumais from Dynamic Choice Hair Salon for offering us that space. Thanks.
Great.
So I just want to again echo all of my appreciation for all of the wonderful staff work that has been happening. I know Councilmember Small has already mentioned our appreciation to Public Works for doing I've dubbed it the do-over for trash because of the Veterans Day holiday. I think it just caught a lot of people off guard, and so I am sending my appreciation to Public Works for getting the trash truck out tomorrow. But more importantly, I'm expressing my commitment to send out reminders on the various listservs, given that we are nearing lots of holiday periods, and often we have to send out on listservs reminders to folks about changes to the trash schedule. So I'm appreciative of Public Works for doing that. Also want to echo Councilmember Hanzak's appreciation. I know Ira was at all of these ribbon cuttings over the weekend, Coma Coffee, Healing Practice, Dynamic Choice. And I want to give a shameless plug for Healing Practice because they are a behavioral health provider. And so I know that has been an area where I've personally received requests from residents that have been looking for someone to provide behavioral health services. And we now have a provider here in the city, and they are accepting patients and they take insurance. So definitely want to put in a shameless plug because I know that there are folks that are in need. Coma Coffee is just delicious coffee. So if you're a coffee connoisseur like myself, go get an espresso. It's the real thing, not the burnt stuff you get from Starbucks. I'm not shaming Starbucks, but it's way better. And Dynamic Choice is just awesome, and I'm hoping to get in there soon. So really excited about the number of businesses that are opening. In terms of folks tonight, Tom, I am so sorry for your loss, and definitely appreciate all of the work that Lou has done to communicate to our community and get the word out about important things. So definitely we share in your loss. Definitely want to thank you for sending me the note about the letter. Very happy to sign on. I know that in the past, and I could send some guidance out to folks, but I know in the past there's been it's not as easy as one would think in terms of determining what we're allowed to sign on to and what we're not. I recognize that was something that we could easily sign on to and signed on behalf of the city, but definitely we'll share some just tricks of the road for colleagues if you're ever debating on whether or not you want to sign on to certain letters that come through and whether or not you have the ability to do so. But definitely want to just reinstate our commitment to maintaining a nuclear-free city and ensuring that we're advocating on behalf of that, whether we have a committee or not. We are committed as a nuclear-free city to continuing to push that agenda. And then lastly, I want to send, because I'm already over time, such an appreciation and thank you to the Boy Scouts for the pancake dinner last night. Councilmember Fulcher, Dabala, Hanzak, and myself had the joy of flipping pancakes. There are pictures to prove that we did all right. So very grateful to our Boy Scouts. It's always such a lovely event. The room is always packed with so many people that are just enjoying. And I cannot stress enough that if you haven't gone, please go because you will get some of the best service that you will ever have gotten at even a Michelin star restaurant. The Boy Scouts are tremendously attentive to you during the pancake supper. So I want to encourage everyone to come out. And I believe that is all I have to report, and I'm going to turn things over to our acting city manager.
Thank you, Mayor, and good evening, Mayor and Council, members of the public, and city staff. Ride on Reimagine, Montgomery County Department of Transportation continues to solicit feedback on the draft Ride on Reimagine review of the Montgomery County bus network. So as a reminder, the deadline for providing feedback is November 15th. The link to the county's website can be found in the city manager's comments tomorrow morning. I want to echo the announcement from Councilmember Gibson about the Montgomery County Planning Board session on Thursday, November 16th. The session itself is from 1 to 6 p.m. Of course, they'll be discussing the MITRE Master Plan Amendment. The link to that session will also be posted on the city manager's comments. And a special note that Acting Director Ira Cowler will be present virtually during the session to answer planning board questions related to the city's housing policies if necessary. The police department will be partnering with Innova Blood Donor Services for the upcoming blood drive on Saturday, December 2nd from 11:30 to 4:30 p.m. here at the community center. Morning time slots are almost full and the afternoon is filling quickly. So please, if you're interested, be sure to register in advance. And once again, that link will be included in the city manager's comments. And then just one final reminder of a special event here in the community center on November 16th at 7:30. The Tacoma Park Arts Program will host a film screening for a documentary called First Step, the details of which can be found on the city's website. And that's all we have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, so we're going to move on to our first presentation for this evening, the Annual Comprehensive Financial Report and Audit. Just as a reminder for colleagues, we've started a new process where we try to provide ourselves with a little bit of a time limit. So for this, for our agenda items, and so for this item, we are anticipating a 40-minute presentation and 20 minutes for Q&A. So with that, I will turn things over to our acting city manager, who will introduce our presenters for this evening.
Great, thank you, Mayor. So the presentation this evening will be of the Annual Comprehensive Financial Report and Audit. As required by the city charter and by state law, an independent audit is conducted of the city's basic financial statements on an annual basis. The auditor's responsibility is to express an opinion on these financial statements based on their review. The auditing firm is to plan and perform the audit to obtain reasonable assurance about whether the financial statements are free of material misstatement. The audit includes examining on a test basis evidence supporting the amounts and disclosures in the financial statements. The audit also includes assessing the accounting principles used and significant estimates made by management, as well as evaluating the overall financial statement presentation. The ACFR also includes a report on the city's internal control over financial reporting and on its tests of the city's compliance with certain provisions of law, regulations, contracts, grants, agreements, and other matters. The purpose of the report is to describe the scope of the firm's testing of internal control over financial reporting and compliance and the results of that testing. It does not constitute an opinion on the internal control over financial reporting or on compliance. The report, though, is an integral part of an audit performed in accordance with the government auditing standards in considering the city's internal control over financial reporting and compliance. And so this evening, presenting a summary of the ACFR will be the city's audit partner, Timothy Sawyer from Barricane, Thornton and Company. So with that, I'll turn it over to Tim to walk us through the ACFR.
Thank you, David.
No problem. Thank you, Tim.
Okay. So I have here, it's actually instead of kind of going through the actual report, but I know you've had a chance to look at that, I will answer any questions you have on that. I'm going to give you more of a higher level overview with my presentation. So kind of go over, I'm going to go over a quick audit timeline, give you an idea of when we did the audit, what our approach was, our areas of emphasis during the audit. Of course, the audit results, which are our opinions on your financial statements. Quick thing on just some other matters, and then I have some financial results which compare the fiscal year 23 to fiscal year 22. So with the audit timeline, we did as things have changed since COVID. We did a hybrid audit approach this year, which means we did come on site and do some audit testing here, as well as had a lot of information uploaded into our secure portal for our other testing. Field work began on September 18th and was completed on October 26th. We did issue a draft report in October that was reviewed and eventually approved by city management. Your uniform financial report, which is due on October 31st, was submitted to the state, and your audit report is dated October 31st. As far as the audit approach goes, always when an audit's done, it's we assess the procedures that are designed so when we design our test, what areas are going to be of greater risk. And in order to do that, it's really a four-part approach to determining which areas are of a greater risk. And that's inquiry and documentation of your controls and procedures, how you process all your transactions. We do a testing of the design and implementation of those controls. And we don't have to do an in-depth test each year, so what we kind of do is we cycle through the various cycles. So you have cash receipts or revenue, cash disbursements or your expenditures, and payroll are your big three that we look at. This year we did a test of controls on payroll, and then we also did do some extra testing of controls with your expenditures in relation to your single audit, which had to do with your federal funds. We also do analytical review of your activities and various account balances, and then we do detailed testing of key activities and looking at other documentation in various areas when we look at the account balances. So the areas of emphasis during the audit is obviously any audit will look at improper revenue recognition in order to make sure that your revenue is fairly stated. We try to do a lot of this if we can through third-party confirmation and review of various supporting documentation. We also do third-party confirmation of your cash accounts and bank balances, as well as your debt. We do a focus on your capital outlay expenditures, obviously, because that's an area where you have a lot more of your money being spent. We also focus on payroll expenditures because obviously any audit, the number one expense everywhere is in your personnel and related costs. And then there's a random selection of other transactions when we look at various account balances that we've identified. Based on our audit, so with the audit results, we did conduct our audit in accordance with the auditing standards generally accepted in the United States of America, or sometimes they're referred to as GAAS, as well as the standards applicable to financial audits contained in government auditing standards issued by the Comptroller General of the United States. A lot of times that's referred to, you'll hear people talk about the Yellow Book. That has to do with your single audit and your federal expenditures. We've issued what are called unmodified or clean audit opinions on the governmental activities, each major fund, and the aggregate remaining fund information. So that what that basically means is you got a clean opinion, means that your financial statements are fairly presented. It's the highest that you can get. Just to point out with other matters, just want to point out that management was helpful and forthcoming throughout the audit, gave us all the information that we requested and very promptly. There were no waived audit adjustments, meaning anything that we had come up with, or if during the process, if they had done a reconciliation and came up with a adjustment, we recorded all that into the financial statements. And we are available year-round for any questions. And we prefer to have questions asked if a certain transaction comes up and you're not quite sure how to handle it or whatever. We do like to have you reach out to us so we can have it recorded properly before we get to the audit. To go over a couple of your results, so for 2023 and 2022, looking at some of your major balances. So your cash and cash equivalents went from 24 million up to about 30 million. And these are, I should say, these numbers come from your statement of net position, which is your what we call government-wide. So that includes all your debt, fixed assets, and other liabilities. Your investments went down from 3 million to about 1.8 million. Your restricted investments were 6.5 both years, and then your capital assets net of accumulated depreciations went from 42.2 million up to about 45.6. And a lot of that had to do as you've started, obviously, construction with the library renovations. Staying on the statement of net position, on the liability side, you had some unearned revenue, bonds and notes payable, and your net pension liability, as well as your total net position. So your unearned revenue went from 7.5 million up to 12.6. What that is really is you had the ARPA funding. So until you actually spend that on the expenditures that you identify for it, it's considered unearned until you actually spend it. So that was the big increase there. Your bonds and notes payable went from 8.1 down to about 7.7, and that's just based on your regular scheduled payments. Your net pension liability, which is based on the valuation reports, went from 13 million up to 13.9, almost 14 million dollars. But overall, your net pension, which is basically your equity, went from net position of 46.5 million up to 51.1 million. So it was about a $4.5 million increase. On the revenue side, now this is more on fund level, so this is more of what you see on a monthly basis when you're looking at your financial reports. So your charges for services went from 2.6 up to 2.7. Operating grants and contributions went from 7.2 up to 11.6. Again, part of that had to be with the part of the ARPA money that you did recognize as revenue this year. Taxes about the same, 19.3 up a little bit to 19.9. Other revenue 2.2 down to 1.6, but overall your total revenue went from 31.7 last year to 36 million this year. On the expense side, if you kind of look at your departments, your general government was 5.8, this year was at 5.2. Public safety is 9 million, went up to about $9.2 million. Public works 7.5 to 7.6 million. Housing and community development had the substantial increase, went from 2 up to 5.5. Rec and culture 4.1 at 3.5 this year, and then your interest was about the same at about 300,000 each year. So overall, your total expenditures were 29.1 million in 2022, and they were 31.5 million in 23. And those are across all funds, by the way. So your fund balance across all funds, so your general fund was at 20.3, in 22 was at 20.5 in 2023, and we'll dive into that one a little bit more because that's the big ones that you work with when you do all your operations. Your speed camera fund was at 667 last year. It's down to 138,000. The special revenue was at 3.7. It's up to 3.7 this year. The ARPA fund, again, because you're basically recognizing the revenue as it comes in and the expenses are being, so the revenue and expenses normally tie out. The little bit there that you see, the increase 272 to 1345 is really the interest that's earned on the money that's in the account. So now with more money in there, you'll probably have more interest earned next year. And then your non-major funds went from 726,000 down to 492. So your total fund balance was at 25.4 last year, and it went down a little bit to 24.9 million this year. Also to point out, the difference in your fund balance compared to your net position. So when you're at fund level compared to your the increase, so you had about a $500,000 decrease in fund balance. But as I said before, your net position went up about $4.5 million. The biggest information or difference on that, and there's a reconciliation on page 39 of the financial statements that'll kind of walk you through more of that. But your biggest contributors to that are your capital outlay was 6.1, almost $6.2 million this year. Those are expenditures at the fund level, whereas at the government-wide or the net statement of net position, they're assets. So they would at the net position level, they reduce your expenses and go onto the balance sheet. So it's kind of the difference in the two accountings from full accrual to modified accrual. There's also depreciation expense that is recorded at the full accrual level of 2.7 million. So if you took that off that 6.2 from the capital outlay, it's about a net of $3.4 million that was increased from your fund level to your statement of net position. And then there's another $1.7 million that has to do with the difference between the net pension liability, deferred inflows and deferred outflows, and the valuation report that we use to do those calculations. So that 1.7 from the pension, deferred inflows, deferred outflows, and the difference in your capital outlay and depreciation is really what took you from that $500,000 loss at fund level to the $4.5 million increase at the statement of net position level. And then if we look at your general fund balance, here, so your non-spendable, which is basically prepaids, was $20,000 last year, is $9,700 this year. Restricted fund balance was at 6.4, it went down to the 5.3. Your committed fund balance was at 9.3 last year, it's at 7 million this year. So your unassigned went from 4.5 up to 8.2 to get your total general fund balance, where it was at 20.3 last year to 20.5 this year. So the reason really that you have is as some of those restrictions and committed fund balances are those what restricts them, or the reason they were committed, as those are met, and they're they don't, for instance, they don't reset say at the same level, then those balances transfer over to the unassigned. So there was this $3.6 million increase in your unassigned balance. It was really due to about a $1.6 million decrease in the bond reserve. So as the bond funds come in, they're restricted because of the bond issue restricts them for a certain purpose. As you make those expenditures and use that money, that restriction in the fund balance goes down. And then there was also about a $2 million decrease in your committed funds related to what you had set aside for subsequent years. Last year I think it was like 3.3 million. This year it was like 1.1. So that $2 million switch is really why we had the change from restricted and committed, and it went into the unassigned columns. And with that, any questions on the presentation or the financial statements?
Thank you so much.
So thank you for talking through how the ARPA dollars are being accounted for, because I am still a little confused by that. So bear with me as I am trying to piece things together, because it has implications, in terms of the expenditures that you see in certain departments as well. So like, for example, HCD, like the Housing and Community Development, you saw this huge increase in their expenditures, but they're the ones that were administering a lot more of those ARPA programs, right? So can you kind of walk back just a little bit so that I can kind of make sure I'm capturing where the ARPA dollars are in your slide deck? So we're counting them now as revenues?
It's recognized as revenue, so that is where I showed that unearned revenue,
Right.
which is basically a liability on your balance sheet. You received that $12 million of ARPA funds. What has not been spent is that 12 million. So when you spend ARPA funds, you recognize the revenue and you recognize the expense, so they basically wash. It's the same numbers. So they will go through, or they would get recognized in the year. Let me see if I can kind of, in the ARPA fund, it's like its own fund. So if you look on page 36 and 38, 36 is the balance sheet, so you can see that there's $12.5 million roughly in ARPA funds that you've received but have not spent yet. And then on page 38, you can see this year we recognized about $3.5 million in revenue, and then the expenses were there was about 171,000 under general government, 2.8 million, as you said before, under housing and community development, and then another about 500,000 used for capital outlay, various purchases of equipment, et cetera.
Okay. Yep, I see it. Okay. And so then, in terms of any interest earned, for example, that's just interest based on the money just sitting, waiting
Correct.
on
And
us to
that's
expend.
basically, that's that $1,200 in miscellaneous was the interest that was earned this year. Of course, since you got more money in there now, and with the way interest rates are, that'll go way up next year.
Okay. And that's helpful because, again, trying to think through conceptually, we've obligated monies, but we haven't necessarily spent those monies. So depending on when those monies are spent, we may see different balances in terms of that ARPA column versus the expenditures column from the general fund that may incorporate those expenses and the like. So, okay, that's helpful because I'm still trying to piece that together in my brain because at one point I thought of it as a whole separate budget just to make my life easier, and now I realize it's all coming together. One question I do have is around, and I know that we're going to have a separate discussion around the police pension. I'm trying to make sure that I understand, because I know at one point in time we had to kind of play a little bit of catch up in terms of our pension liabilities. And so I'm just trying to make sure that I understand where we are in terms of that catch-up game that we had to do. I know that there was some change in the rules. We weren't accounting for it appropriately. It wasn't you, somebody else. And so we've been having to play a little bit of catch-up in terms of making sure that we're allocating the right amount of monies. Where are we in terms of that, if my question makes sense?
Mayor, it might make sense to hold that question for the next session.
Okay.
I think they'll be able to give a more thorough answer.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And then I'm just trying to make sure that I didn't flag anything else. Forgive me, this is a large document. I think that's it. So just in kind of plain language speak, we're often asked about, where we are in terms of whether or not we're at a deficit, right? Our revenues less than our expenditures. And now, I understand that there are some aspects of the change in our net position that's tied to our assets. But it did look like in one of your slides that the reality is we're a little balanced. We're probably a little too close for comfort, but our numbers are such that we are not necessarily operating in this budget under a functioning deficit, so to speak.
Correct. So so again, if you go back to page 38, that's at what we call the fund level, and that's more in terms of what you budget and operate on a year-to-year basis. So, yeah, this year I would say, it was a $568,000 deficit for '23.
Okay.
In '22, you had a $1.2 million surplus. So, I mean, you will kind of bounce up and down based on what the funding is. And obviously, you know, most of this year's kind of was driven, I guess, by the loss, if you will, in the speed camera fund.
Okay.
So, you know, maybe if, depending on, you know, if you're looking at the cost associated with that compared to the revenue, you know, it's one place to go. But I would say, you know, $568,000 on, you know, the numbers that you have in your size of a budget's, you know, about as close to even as you can get without, you know, fudging it to get it to an exact zero. So.
Okay. All right. Excellent. Thank you for that.
And Mayor, for some more context, the projected deficit, if you will, was $9 million. At the, I guess, once you tally up all of the amendments throughout the course of the year.
Right.
And then the fund, the reduction in fund balance, I think we can attribute primarily to the fact that we didn't realize the red light camera funds due to basically the delay at the state. If you all recall, Council, that we in FY23 moved a significant number of general fund expenses over to the speed camera fund, anticipating that new revenue source would be realized. It wasn't, and so that's primarily what we are realizing in the deficit of $500,000. I mentioned last week that expectation is in the next 3 to 4 months that those dollars will be realized. So we're keeping our fingers crossed that we won't experience the same thing this year.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
And
And
I'm sorry, go ahead.
just kind of felt, just as David did point out, if you look at page 40, that's where you can see your general fund budget compared to the actual. So, and that's where he's shown, you had after all amendments, you had about a $9.3 million loss. Actual was at 390, but then we had some accounting adjustments that we had to make for a lease that had to be recorded this year. So you went from a $390,000 deficit up to $238,000. So you had a nice swing from an anticipated, you know, fund balance loss of 9.3 to the original 390 based on just expenses. So, you know, you were almost $9 million better than what you had anticipated. So.
Great. Excellent. Thank you. Councilmember Small.
Thank you, Mayor. I wanted to go back a little bit to kind of a discussion more about revenues and flows of money. And in particular, in the budget that we're talking about, we have some like if you would go to 28 rather than 38 when you're reading through the overviews, we talk about the expenditures being so much less than what we budgeted and things like that. Some of that is policy or hard on the ground stuff that did or didn't happen in here. But as we start to look at, as we are processing through from one year to the other about monies that are coming in or monies that are unspent and the relative flow, there are some highlights here about a couple of departments that are doing better than some other departments with regard to balance sheet issues, whether that be just because of activity or not. And I was wondering if between you guys we could talk more about where we are seeing value with regard to revenue recapture from things that don't happen per se from year to year, and the sort of increases or projected increases in areas. In particular, there's a pretty significant note in here about the increase in our actual incoming operating monies because of the tax increases in personal property taxes. So I was curious if we could have that kind of a discussion a little bit out loud so that people would know that we're sort of talking about two different things, because we're also talking about, as a city, a lot of theoretical bills coming due with regard to how we pay for things anyway. And so talking about the two different things in that way, I think, might be helpful.
Thank you for the question, Councilmember Small. I'll speak to expenses first. Tim and Susan, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I believe that the majority of the department level savings is a result primarily of vacancies in FY23. And that the increases that we do see in some departments, I'm thinking particularly police, is a result of increases in salaries that I think was a result of some adjustments that were made at the beginning of FY23. Is that a correct statement?
Madam Mayor and Council, good evening. We want to look at the financial report on page 40. This particular page is called Budgetary Comparison Statement General Fund. It gives a very good snapshot of what was our budgeted fund balance and what was our actual expenditure and revenue. And then it gives us a favorable and unfavorable variance. So when we look at the revenue side, the favorable in revenue is mainly in the taxes and utility fees. We can see that there is an increase of revenue between the final appropriated budget and also the actual expenditure. Final revenue is $717,000 in taxes and utility fee. And the other part in the revenue is the uses of money, the charges of revenue or service, and intergovernmental. And these shows a positive increase in all these revenue items. So the total revenue increase between the budgeted amount and also the actual amount is $1.4 million, okay? And on the other hand, besides the increase of the revenue, we also had reduction of expenditure, okay? So when you look at the general government, the budgeted amount for expenditure was 5.8 million, but the actual amount was only 4.8. So we had a reduction of 1,030,000, okay? And the second largest reduction is in the public works. And this is just a general fund. We're not talking about the other fund levels, ARPA funds and stuff like that. So in the public works, we had a reduction of expenditure of 1.1 million. And then on the capital outlay, which is mainly the capital projects that we put in CIP, there was a reduction of $3.8 million. So the total reduction between the budget amount and also the actual amount in expenditure, it was 7.4 million. So with the increase of revenue and the reduction of the expenditure, it tells us, you know, practically why we are showing a better picture in the actual financial performance than compared to the budgeted amount, okay? So this is a very good report that is very helpful for us to understand. The main reason why there is a difference between the actual and also the budgeted amount is because of the execution rate. We executed and appropriate less than what we already budgeted. So that's the main reason.
Yes, and thank you, Ms. Jung, for that. I appreciate that. I think that is a really good analysis of the issue. And the reason why I brought that up in particular is because if you separate the revenue components from some of the expenditures, like essentially that we recapture to some degree at the end of the budget, then you do see some positive things that are happening as a result of the way in which the staff and the government is operating, because there is more money technically coming in than we had anticipated going out. regardless of whether or not, because expenditures would be where we're recapturing all of the salary money, I would assume, right? So I just wanted to highlight that as a part of where the government is and some optimism about that and some opportunity to see and where choices are made both by default and moving forward into the next budget cycle. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Councilmember Fulcher?
Just in looking at the speed camera fund and how it hasn't been as predictable as we would like it to be, I'm just wondering if maybe in the future, if we're not able to get to where we want to be, where it is predictable, that we might want to decide that we're going to spend that revenue on a different expenditure other than salaries, because we can't adjust that at all. We can't decide we're not going to pay those people. And so there might be another way to plan to spend that money where if it doesn't come in the way that we'd like it to see, that we're able to adjust. And, you know, I'm accepting that we might have to dip into reserves when those funds don't come in how we'd like them to come in, but it's pretty drastic, the amount that didn't come in and the amount that we were expecting.
Thank you, Councilmember Fulcher, for that point. I know that during the last budget cycle, we were also debating on what we could perhaps fund using some of our speed camera dollars. And now seeing the volatility associated with that fund, we may not want to put all of our eggs in that basket, especially as we're getting ready to deal with the next budget. Okay, not seeing any additional lights. Thank you very much. We're going to move on to our next.
Well, have a good night.
Thank you so much. We're going to move to the next presentation, police pension plan actuarial valuation. Just as a reminder for folks, this presentation is slated for 25 minutes, and then we have 30 minutes for Q&A. Yep, everyone should have it in your packets. Alrighty. All right, so I'm going to turn things, Mr. Eubanks, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Mayor. This evening, we'll be presenting the Police Employees Retirement Plan Actuary Valuation as of June 30th, 2023. In 2001, the City of Tacoma Park established a pension plan for its sworn police officers. The Police Employees Retirement Plan allows for the full retirement after 25 years of service or at age 62 with 5 years of service. Bolton Retirement provides actuary services for the plan and prepares an annual valuation based on participant data and asset information. The July 1st, 2023 valuation is setting the employer contribution for the fiscal year ending on June 30th, 2025. This evening we have Tom Vicente, Senior Consulting Actuary of Bolton Retirement, who will present the actuary report. Following the presentation, Tom will make himself available for questions, and I think Tom is also joined by Mr. Jordan McLean. Tom, I will turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, David, appreciate it. Do you want me to share my screen, or are you better off just looking at what you have in front of you?
If you could share your screen, please. Thank you, Tom.
Mm-hmm. It's not good. I think I'm just sharing myself here. Hold on. Jordan, do you have the presentation up? Are you able to share that?
Yeah,
Maybe you can do that better than I can. Thank you.
How's that look?
Very good. Thank you, Jordan. I can see it now. Well, thank you very much for having us in today. We'll go through this, our annual review of the report. We'll take a little bit of background so that I know this isn't something necessarily everybody in the room does every day like we do. So we always like to do a little bit of background information. Jordan, if you go ahead to, I think, slide 5, so we get to the meat of the information. So just by way of background, where this plan came from, Originally, the police were part of the Maryland state plan, but back in '01, the town wanted to give the employees a separate plan that was more suitable to public safety, but did not want to be part of the state's LEOPS plan. They wanted more control. So the plan was started then. We have a lot of assumptions built into the plan. One of the most important ones is the long-term rate of return assumption, which is the last bullet here. Currently, we're using a 7.25% long-term rate of return, which has been in place for the last 6 years. Good, next slide, please. So current provisions, as David mentioned, officers can retire after 25 years with essentially a half pay benefit. There's early retirement available if they want. There's also a post-retirement cost living adjustment. And this is an important aspect of the plan. There is a cap of 3% per year on the post-retirement cost living adjustment, but it's an aggregate 3%. So if, for example, the increase is based on CPI increases, but if the CPI increases are less than 3% a year, then essentially that underage gets banked. And so a year where the CPI change is higher, individuals can get a higher than 3% increase in a particular year. This is just for retirees. This most recent year for 2023, the CPI change was 6.5%. And because inflation had been low for the last 5 or 6 years before these last few years, a number of the retired officers got a bigger increase than 3%, which has an impact on plan costs. Disability benefits provided for officers who suffer a disability. The employees, the officers do contribute to the plan. They contribute 7% of pay, which is right in line with what's going on in the state of Maryland. And there is a drop feature, which was implemented a couple years ago. And we do have 2 officers now who are participating in the drop feature. Going on to the valuation results, as was mentioned, this is our annual valuation, which means what happens is we take a snapshot of the census information as of July 1st of each year and a snapshot of the assets. And we use those to develop a projection of what the future benefit payouts will be over the next 70 years for the existing group. And we use a lot of statistics and assumptions about will officers stay to retirement? If they stay to retirement, when will they retire? Will they retire early in age or normal age or a late age? What kind of pay increases will they receive? How long will they live? All those kind of assumptions are built in to the calculations. No changes in those calculations from prior years, so no assumption changes this year at all. However, this year we did have a couple of negative plan outcomes. One is that the funded ratio of the plan declined. So the plan had been 78% funded on what they call a smooth asset basis previously. That did decline to 75%. We'll go into the reasons for that in a minute. From a contribution standpoint, this is the contribution for fiscal 2025. So this is what this report produces, is the estimate for that period. Preliminarily, we calculated a contribution rate of 52.26% of covered payroll. However, after having some back and forth and discussions about different approaches, we made some revisions and came up with a final contribution rate of 45.58% of covered payroll. And we'll talk about those in a moment. The 45.58 is lower than the 47.27% that was from the prior year. However, on a dollar basis, it's projected to be higher than the prior year because payroll is higher now than it was a couple of years ago. The big drivers when we talk about the funded ratio going down and the contribution rates going up are the 3 items at the bottom of the page. So it's that post-retirement cost living adjustment was because of the higher inflation, we ended up giving out a higher cost of living adjustment than had been assumed. And we have these long-term assumptions in. So what happens in any given year, what actually happens is going to be higher or lower than what was assumed. So in this case, in this particular year, that post-retirement cost of living adjustment was higher. So that's a higher liability since those benefits are payable in the future. The other thing that happened is that we have a higher head count. So 2 additional officers, but when you only have 38 or 40 officers, 2 is a big percentage. And payroll went up. So there were definitely some pay increases given out to the group that increased pay higher than what had been assumed. So those are both 2 things that help drive up the plan liabilities. On the asset side, even though we had an investment return that was higher than our 7.25% return for the current year, because we used a phased asset valuation method, we actually are still feeling the effects of phasing in the large asset losses that occurred for year-end 2022, when we had a negative, I think, 15% return for the year. So we're still overcoming that effect, and the better returns this year were nice, and they did help offset some of that. They weren't enough to offset all of the negative returns that we're still phasing in. So that also had a negative impact on cash contributions and the funded ratio. Go next page. Thank you. So here's our plan participation. So just to level set, here's how we have 40. So on the right-hand side is the current census snapshot, 40 actives, not in the drop. We did have 2 officers in drop. So they're actively working, but for pension purposes, they're treated as if they had retired, but they are still active employees and active officers. You'll see there's more retirees, and item C, retirees, beneficiaries, and survivors. So that's folks who are receiving pensions from 29 up to 32. Our terminated vested, which are folks who have left employment but are owed a pension sometime in the future, went down a little bit, as did the number of individuals who are awaiting a refund of contributions. So these are folks who left who aren't vested, and they'll receive a payout sometime in the future. Altogether, a small increase in the number of individuals. The payroll did go up quite a bit as a percentage. That's about a 14% increase from 3.1 to 3.6, and that has a big impact on the plan costs. Next page shows us some of the actuarial liabilities we calculate. You can see we've broken them down here between those who are active, those in pay, those who are inactive and not yet in pay, and then the total. So in total, liabilities are now $32.5 million. That's line item 4 versus 29.6 a year ago. And the actuarial value of assets, number 5, went from 23 million to 24.2, which is an increase, but it's not as big an increase as if we had been credited with the full 7.25%. And again, that's that smoothing in of asset returns that averages out some of the ups and downs, that keeps things a little more steady. However, so it keeps you from realizing a bad year all at once, but then you end up realizing that bad year for several years in a row, though in smaller portions. The net result of all that was item 6, was the unfunded liability, which shows we went from 6.5 million up to 8.2 million, which is about 75%. So assets are about 75% of liabilities versus 78% last year. So that's what we were talking about, the funded ratio declining. Those are the figures we're talking about there. And again, the reasons for that decline are the higher pay, which increased liabilities, the higher COLAs, which increased liabilities, and the lingering effects of the 2022 asset returns. Getting to the contribution for 2025 for budget purposes, as we mentioned, there was an increase. We talked about that. We did look at making some different adjustments this year. The initial ADC, which is the actuarially determined contribution, was $1.9 million, which was a 52.26% of payroll. Recognizing that's a very sharp increase, we looked into some adjustments that could be made to the calculation while still staying within strong actuarial practice. So I want to emphasize that we made some adjustments, but the plan is still on the same timeline to be funded. Nothing we're doing is pushing back the funding or being more aggressive in assumptions. But we were able to make some adjustments and bring that contribution rate down to just under 1.7 million, which is 45.6% of payroll. The 2 adjustments we made is in the $1.9 million, we had an adjustment to account for the cash contribution being made late in the fiscal year. After talking with the city, we adjusted that to account for the fact that the plan is to make the contribution early in the fiscal year, so we don't have to charge interest. The other is that we have, within the funding policy, we have a series of what we call amortization bases, all being due at different times. And there's one that was due in 12 years, and we just stretched that out to 15 years. So added 3 years to it, and that helped to adjust that ADC. Again, our total funding policy has the full liability, unfunded liability, being paid out over 22 years or being paid down over 22 years. So this adjustment from 12 to 15 years does not change that pay down over 22 years. That's still in place. So that's the contribution. The next section we talk about are the accounting results. So this is we call GASB 68. So your Barbara Kane Thornton was just here. They talked about what's on the financial statements. These are the pension numbers that go on the financial statements. So they're different than the funding numbers. There's some different rules. There's some different requirements that are used. So the numbers are a little bit different. But this is what goes on the balance sheet that was just talked about. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see there the figures are a little bit different. Here we're showing a funded liability of 76%. When doing the GASB 68 work, you're not allowed to use the smooth asset value. You have to use just the market value. So this is as of June 30, 2023. So it was almost $23 million there. The pension liability was $30 million under the GASB 68 accounting rules. So again, just a little bit different than the funding rules. So that's why the funding ratio here is a little bit higher than we just saw for funding purposes. And these are just all set by the accounting standards that we follow so that you can certify using GAAP accounting. There's an accounting expense. That's the two bullet items at the bottom. So different than your cash contribution, there's an accrual accounting expense that you take. In this case, it'll be $699,965 for fiscal 2023. But that again, that's different than the funding amounts. And then to wrap up, we just want to touch on a couple of emerging topics that we've talked with the pension committee about and just like to just bring up. So one thing we'd like to mention is that, COVID-19 really did a lot that affected pension plans, among other things, of course. So there was certainly definitely an increased mortality in the US in general over those 3 years where COVID was really the new and the strongest. That's really come down a lot. And there's still a lot of question about whether COVID-19 will continue to have an impact on mortality rates as compared to prior to 2020. Right now, the rates have really come down quite a bit, but it's still unsure, especially with long-term COVID. So right now, we're taking, along with most of the entire industry, taking a wait and see approach. So we're not adjusting our expectations for longevity at this point. However, we did also see changes in retirement patterns and turnover patterns. Public safety was one of the groups that was impacted pretty severely by the turnover and retirement patterns. If you recall, in 2020, there was also a lot of protests around police and the way policing was being done in certain areas of the country, and that did really affected law enforcement officers in a lot of ways. Just because of the change in attitudes. And so we did see a lot of turnover and a lot of retirement in different groups, which led to retention challenges and inflation challenges, both those items. So the retention challenge is one reason we've seen, just as we saw here at Tacoma Park, we've seen in many of our clients larger than typical pay increases as different cities and towns and counties work to retain their staff for longer by offering higher pay increases. More generally, there's been more focus on disclosing risks that affect pension plans. And there's something called the LD-ROM disclosures, which stands for Low Default Risk Obligation Measure. So this is an actuarial disclosure, which gives you a sense for what the plan liabilities would look like if you invested in low default risk bonds. So treasury bonds, for example, or high quality municipal bonds versus the diversified portfolio you use today. So these are things all being talked about. There certainly are employers looking at plan design changes and sometimes that raises litigation if there's a cutback on benefits. Generally speaking, we've been reviewing all our assumptions for clients. You may recall that a year or so ago, we did update the longevity table for this plan. We haven't updated any of the other assumptions for a few years. We probably look at that over the period between now and March and seeing if there's any reason to make any changes in the way our assumptions are working in terms of when folks are expected to retire or how long they're supposed to stay. We expect them to stay with Tacoma Park given updates and changes in the environment. So that really wraps up our, I'm sorry, I forgot this. Thank you, Jordan. So I mentioned the long-term rate of return assumptions. Tacoma Park uses a 7.25% long-term rate of return, which you've had in place for the last 6 years. This is a chart from NASRA, the National Association of State Retirement Administrators. So they do a survey of the largest plans in the United States, so state and large city pension plans. And this colorful chart that you have here is trying to show from left to right. It's going forward chronologically from 2001 to 2024, fiscal year end 2024, and say what is the long-term rate of return assumption that is being used. And on the far right-hand side, you can see the median currently for that group is about 7%. The 7 to 7.5%, just above that in tan, is pretty wide, as is the 6.5 to 7 below that. So you're at 7.25%. So you're a little more aggressive than what this median is showing. However, what this chart can't tell you is what the relative asset allocations are for your plan versus these other plans. So some of these plans in this chart may be more conservative than you are, and so they may be using a lower discount rate for those purposes. Bottom line is you're a little bit higher than the median nationally, but not overly so. And we don't feel there's any real need, unless there's an asset allocation change, to really look at making that change, any kind of change to that assumption at this time. With that, we want to turn it over to any questions that the group might have about us for the presentation or the actual report in general.
Great. Thank you so much. Councilmember Small.
Thank you, Mayor. I appreciate this, and I particularly appreciated the very first part of the presentation where there was some explanation about the motivation of having this as our police pension vehicle vis-a-vis the state pension system. But I was curious about whether or not we could know how much more we are, or less, we are paying into pensioning because we have a separate system. And the last time that we had this presentation, we're kind of stuck on that as an issue. I do know that internally that there are some people who are very big advocates of us having our own pension system. And I'm not trying to say anything about the policy implications of one or the other. But I would like to know what the cost differences would be or are vis-a-vis the money that we are spending, because it just seems reasonable to know. So I completely understand if you guys don't have that necessarily today, but I would defer to the actuarial people as to what those numbers are, as opposed to the staff. So if you could do that for me, I would really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah. What we'll do is we can determine what the contribution rates would be for the state LEOPS plan, since that would be the design that was most similar to this. Does that make sense, versus comparing it to the general employee state plan?
Oh yeah, no, for sure. Because recognizing that I do understand that there's a separate pension system with regard to law enforcement officers or public safety officers than just the state pension employees plan. And again, this is primarily because if we're going to be wedded to a institutional policy, it's both important to know where it comes from and how much it actually is costing. Thank you.
Yep, we can pull those numbers for you and send something over.
Councilmember Fulcher.
I just have a question about the previous slide. If you could go back. You said that we're close to what the median is with the investment in this in relation to large cities, a large city study. But would we fit the definition of a large city, and like how might that affect what we should be investing because we are a small city?
Right. So we use this table because it's readily available. So it's a survey of I think it's a couple hundred different employers across the government employers across the U.S. And so NASRA puts it together. So it's they've done the legwork to look up all these individual sets of assumptions. So that's why we use it. So it doesn't necessarily say that it's large organizations, because that's who NASRA deals with, and that's who their sort of membership is. So that's what they gather. So we find it useful because it does give a good cross-section across the country of what different pension plan managers are thinking of in terms of their long-term rates of return, and especially shows how it changed over time. I mean, if you look all the way to the left, the average was about 8% 20 years ago, and now the average is 7%. And you can see how as the sort of ribbons of color go up the chart, you can see how that changed over time. As essentially what happened over this time is that as fixed income investments, long-term interest rates on bonds and treasuries were pushed down, especially post-2008. That reduced some of the ability to get higher returns. And so a lot of pension plans started recognizing that by lowering their expected rate of return, and as did Tacoma Park when you went from 7.5% down to 7.25% as your long-term expected rate of return. I would say over the last 10 years, we do keep track of what you've been doing, and when you do averages, even 10-year averages, there's a fair amount of that percent return that's really dependent on the endpoints you use. So you want to be careful using that. But using the actual value of assets, for you over the last 10 years, the investment return has averaged 7.3%. So the 7.25% has been a good assumption over that period of time. So even though you're a little above this sort of benchmark or national average survey, as far as averages, you can see you're not alone. And your performance has borne out the 7.25% as a reasonable assumption.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you so much. This has been really, really helpful. And I'm just, it's a lot of information, so I'm trying to digest it all. One question I have, which I think may be quick, is the fact that I saw that there's, I'm looking at page 20, but there's also a lot of other graphs that are showing a lot of volatility in terms of the return on the investment in 2020 in particular.
Right.
And so, are there any things that we should be considering or have to do, to try to address that, or are you thinking that over time it will naturally smooth itself out? Like all of these kind of bumps in the road just naturally over time will smooth in terms of the returns?
So that is the philosophy. So when I mentioned we use what we call the actuarial value of assets, which is the smooth assets. Essentially what we're doing is phasing in investment returns that are higher or lower than the 7.25% assumption each year. Each year, of course, we're either higher or lower than 7.25. And so we take whatever that delta is, whatever that difference is, and we phase it in over 5 years. And so that has the effect of creating offsets. So even though the market value of assets may shoot way up and shoot way down, our actuarial value will stay relatively steady. And that's if you're looking on the full actuarial report on page 19, there's a graph at the top of that page, that page 19, that shows the orange line is the actuarial value, and you see there's not a lot of peaks and valleys there, while the blue line, which is the market value, has some ups and downs. Generally speaking, your asset performance has been pretty stable, but you're going to have these years sometimes, especially when there's extraordinary events like 2008 or 2022 with the pandemic, and then this past year, or I guess the year coming off 2022, off 2021, where there were some really sharp increases and decreases. But generally speaking, the averaging, the asset smoothing approach you've been using has been working well to keep the contribution volatility lower. Well, we still keep it though. Like everything will eventually come to the market value. So we're not creating a situation where we're not funding the plan. We're just doing it over a gradual period of time so that when there are these ups and downs, you don't have to come up with on the one hand, you're not getting this great budget windfall because the contribution goes down 1 year, but then the next year it comes back. So we smooth that out so it keeps the budgeting process a little more even.
Great, thank you. And one last question. So I know that you had mentioned earlier about, the impact of having like 2 additional officers kind of come on board. And I'm looking at the active age and service distribution of our officers. And it kind of looks like, if I'm reading this right, given the average age of folks that tend to retire, that we have, what, like 8 or 9 folks that may be in that age bracket. Did you all take into consideration how, the age of our force may play into some of the assumptions regarding how much we may need to make sure that we're contributing? Does that play a role?
It does indeed. So we're using your actual census. So we're taking into account each individual person's age and service levels as of July 1st, and we're projecting it forward, and we're saying, okay, when is each individual person going to reach eligibility to retire? And then when are they likely to retire after they reach eligibility? So if you have one individual who is over 60, at least as of July 1, 2023, they were over age 60 and they had over 20 years of service. So they're squarely able to retire. And so there's a higher chance they're going to retire in the short term versus somebody we have a person who was 55 with 10 years of service. So they could retire too, but they take a reduced pension if they did. And so there's a lesser likelihood they might retire, and we account for that, but we don't believe they will 100% retire this year because they take a reduction. We say there's some likelihood, and then as they get older and closer to getting that full pension, we increase our expected likelihood that they'll retire. And we bake that all into the calculations we're doing. So for any one person, we're not saying you'll retire tomorrow. We're saying there's a chance you might retire next year, or you might keep working and you'll retire in a later year. And so we have a lot of statistics that we build into the calculations to account for that. One of the challenges of your group is that with 40 people, if you had 400 people, then the statistics work a little better. When you have 40 people, it's a little bit lumpy, where what we mean by that is that you might go a couple years where nobody retires, and then you'll go a couple years where 3 or 4 people retire. Right. And that's just a consequence of having a smaller group, that you don't get everything spread out in nice, even statistical packages.
Yeah, thank you. And that was, the one thing that I was trying to think through is, what happens when you hit that bump in the road and what that may mean for our contributions. And then the last question I have, and again, I could totally be misremembering, but at one point there were some concerns a couple years back around the levels of contributions that we needed to make to our pension plan. And we were kind of doing this bit of a catch-up due to some accounting things that happened. Are we now, to some degree, current with the amount of contributions that we need to make in terms of our pension allocations, or are we still trying to add contributions to try to make up any lost years of contributions?
As far as I'm aware, you're making contributions that are current. So the contribution that we calculate is composed of 2 things. It's composed of the cost of benefits the officers are earning because they're still working. So every year they work, their benefit gets a little bigger. So you're paying for that incremental increase in their benefits each year, the value of it. And in addition to that, because the plan's not at 100% funded, we said you were around 75% funded. The other piece of the contribution is an amount that's designed to take you from 75% to 100% funded over essentially a 20-year period. So that is something that's ongoing, but that's just a consequence of the plan and how these plans work. When you first start the plan up, there's a liability, and you've been improving that funded ratio. If you go back 15 years or so, going back to 2008, for example, the plan was only about 34% funded then, and now you're up at 75% funded. So you've shown good, pretty steady progress over the last 15 years in terms of improving the funding of the plan. The last couple of years, with the big decrease in assets, the asset losses from year ending 2022, that pulled it back just a little bit. You went from 70, almost 80% down to 78, now 75% this year. But overall, you've been moving in the right direction pretty consistently, with a couple of little hiccups just like this year where things dip down, but then you get back onto it. So your contributions have been following the actuarially recommended contributions, which means that over time we'll gradually build up that funding ratio and fully fund the plan.
Great, thank you so much. Councilmember DeBall?
So follow up on that. So the actually recommended contribution that you all are recommending this year does or does not include some contribution to catching up from the 75% to 100? And if so, how big is that?
Sure. So the $1,000,007, $1,006,000, or the 45.58% of pay contribution has those two pieces in it, just as it has every year. There's two pieces. One is a payment of the unfunded liability, which is again part of the contribution, and one's the cost of normal cost. So let me just bear with me for a second while I flip through the report and find the right page. So it looks like of the contribution, and roughly $1 million of that money is for the current costs of the officers. So the officers who are working, and every year as they earn a little more pension, you have to pay for that additional piece of pension. That's about $1 million of the $1,006,000. The rest of the $676,000, the rest of the $676,000 is paying down that unfunded, which is sort of like a debt. It's a piece of principal and it's a piece of interest that you're paying down. And I'll stop there. There's a lot of more technical details. I love to talk about them, but not everybody wants to hear them all the time. So I will restrain myself for a moment, but I'll be happy to go into more detail if you'd like.
That's okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Councilmember Hanzak?
Yeah, if you could, I'm sorry if I missed it, but if you could just explain to me again, perhaps, why we started with this not funded liability so long ago. I'm not sure. Is that just because we switched over from the Maryland plan?
So what usually happens, so I wasn't with Tacoma Park in 2001 when you switched over, but what I imagine happened, because this is what typically happens, when you brought over from the Maryland plan was not fully funded. So the Maryland plan was, maybe that plan was 30% funded. So you pulled you out of that plan. So now the city was responsible for the full benefits for the officers, and the state plan would give you money that you put in, but only in proportion to how well funded the overall plan was. So if the overall plan that you were in with the state was 30% funded and you took your money out, you would essentially have a new plan that was only 30% funded. And then you would have to pay the difference. And the other thing that would have happened is you were 30% funded for the benefits that were part of the general municipal pool, which is a plan that's geared more toward non-public safety employees. And non-public safety employees tend to have later retirement ages because their jobs are somewhat different. Public safety generally, there's generally considered that the age to which you can work in public safety is a bit lower than in some of the other jobs that you might have within the city because of the nature of the profession. And so as part of pulling it out, you also created a public safety pension plan, which had higher benefits and earlier retirement ages than what they had in the Maryland state system. So essentially you were promising the officers you're going to get this higher benefit, which created a liability. So the value of that promise is a liability, and that's what you're funding. You're funding the value of that promise. So that's how back in 2001 the plan would have been underfunded, because you essentially created a plan with a lot of promises, but it was just starting out, so there wasn't a lot of money in it, and then you've been building up gradually ever since.
Councilmember DeBala?
Yes, one more, two more questions on this topic. So where in the report were you looking when you talked about the two parts of the payment, the current service dollars and the catch-up dollars?
Sure. So if you look on page 9 of the valuation report,
Okay.
and the valuation report shows the initial ADC, the $1.9 million.
Right.
So we haven't sent over the report that shows the adjusted number, the revised number, but the $1.9 million is the figure that's at the bottom of page 9 of
Right.
the report.
And so the two parts of that are numbers 1 and
1 and 2.
1 and 2? Thank
Yeah.
you. And so I am not suggesting we do this. Let me say that again. I am not suggesting anything, but I feel compelled to ask, what happens if a community doesn't pay all of the recommended catch-up amount in a given year?
So
Is
there
that-
can be a lot.
Is
Yeah.
that illegal?
Is that for
Start
me,
with
or
that.
is I mean, I can answer from an actuarial standpoint.
Thank you, Tom.
So from an actuarial standpoint, what that means is it's like if you have a car loan or a home loan and you don't pay your regular payment. So what happens? A car loan, of course, they could foreclose and come to get your car. They're not going to come take your pension away. But essentially, that money goes into the future and you have a higher payment in the future. So if you miss a payment, and in 2008 in the financial crisis, there were plenty of governments across the country who took or were forced to take a contribution holiday, so to speak, where they didn't make their contribution. And essentially what that meant was that they were going to pay themselves back or pay the pension plan back that missed contribution over some period of time in the future. So it backloads the money that the organization or the government will have to pay into the plan. So that's one consequence. So it's sort of you pay a little less today, it means you're going to pay more tomorrow. The other actuarial event that can happen is that from a financial statement standpoint, it sends a red flag, perhaps, or potentially sends a red flag to your credit rating agencies. So if the entity is going to be looking to borrow money, the fact that you weren't making your full contributions could show up on the credit rating agency's analysis, and they would potentially lower the credit rating of the entity so that you are no longer as creditworthy because they're saying, wait, this organization has cash flow problems. They can't make a regularly scheduled payment. So maybe that means they'll default on a bond sometime in the future. And so they potentially, again, this is all, nothing is in stone. No one comes and says it's not an automatic thing, but these are the kind of things that can happen if you forego a pension payment. So generally, rating agencies, they all like to see a consistency of effort and a consistency of contributions and making the contribution. That being said, you do have control to some extent over the funding policy that you have. So as I said, we have a policy here where we fund the normal cost every year, and we also fund the unfunded liability in a laddered basis, stretching out over as far as 20 years. So some organizations use 25 years, some use 15 years. So every entity has the ability to say, this is the policy we're going to follow because it fits best for our group. Generally speaking, for a public safety group, the time you're using is really is a good time frame to fund the plan because of the length of time the officers typically work, about 25 years. So you're paying for their full benefit over the 25 years they're working for you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Tom, especially that last bit of caution. Has been, I heard you. So thank you so much for coming out, and Jordan, thank you both for all of the hard work that you've done on this report, and for continuing to ensure that we are making appropriate contributions into our pension funds.
Okay, well, thank you for having us, and we were planning on coming down on Wednesday, but today unfortunately worked out to be virtual. So hopefully next year we'll be there in the flesh, as they say.
Definitely, we'll look forward to seeing you in person next year.
Please send me my
Okay,
email.
thank you.
Please send
Take
that
care.
email to me, please.
Yes.
Okay.
Will do.
All right. So quick check with colleagues. We normally take a break around this time. We have our last agenda item that is 40 minutes. Are folks willing to power through, or do we need a 5-minute break?
Okay, all right. We will be back at 9:20.
Going to reconvene tonight's meeting of the Tacoma Park City Council with our last presentation. The final presentation is the final report of the long-term financial forecast. And just as a reminder for my colleagues, we will have a 20-minute presentation followed by a 20-minute Q&A. With that, I will turn it over to our acting city manager, Mr. Eubanks.
Thank you, Mayor. The purpose of the financial forecast is to evaluate current and future fiscal conditions to guide policy and program decisions. A financial forecast is a fiscal management tool that presents estimated information based on past, current, and projected financial conditions. This will help identify future revenue and expenditure trends that may have an immediate or long-term influence on government policies, strategic goals, or community services. On March 22nd of this year, an initial forecast analysis based on the property tax rate of 0.5397 and budgeted information of the FY23 budget was presented to City Council. This financial forecast is an analysis of the FY24 adopted budget with a tax rate of 0.5522 and budgeted information, budget information, of which was included in the FY24 adopted budget. So this evening, we have Raftellus Executive Vice President Mike Burton, who will walk us through the presentation and make himself available for any questions. And I will turn it over to Mike, who's joining us virtually.
Thank you, David. Just check, can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, super. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but I do want to go through this presentation with you, and I think the plan is for me to share my screen. So if that's okay, I'll go ahead and do that now. Let's hope the magic works. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes, Mike, we can see it.
Okay, great.
Mike, before you move on, can you full screen the presentation?
Is it not full screen?
No, we see your slides, all of the slides on the left-hand side, and then the presentation screen on the right.
So let me see.
I think if you hit from the beginning, it should start.
I thought that's what I did. So now I have it with just a working view right now. And is that what you're seeing with the slides on the left and the slide that it's on the right?
Yeah, we're seeing exactly what you're seeing.
So if I go from the beginning, I did that. Let's see. Let me do it this way. Did that work any better?
No.
Okay. Let me see. Hold on a second. Is that still having the same problem?
I think if you hit the button on the right-hand side of your screen at the bottom that looks like a screen with like a lollipop.
That one right there?
The lower right. Lower right.
Lower right.
Yeah, next to the thing, it's the slider, yeah.
I don't see it. I don't see what you're
You see where all the
talking
little
about.
icons are on the lower right-hand side of your screen? I think you should be able to see those.
Well, they're on the left-hand side of my screen. There's two arrows and
Do you
the
see
little
something that says
pencil.
notes? Do you see the word notes twice? Do you see the word notes twice on your screen? You see one that says click to add notes, and then you should see a notes like immediately below that to the right.
I don't see that.
Oh. Yeah, well, yeah. In theory, it looks like to us that you have an icon at the bottom right of your screen that looks like the icon that's on larger and on the top left that says from beginning. So we were just trying to hope that that was it, but we've exhausted our usefulness now. over here on the right of the dais.
Can you see the presentation as it sits right there?
Yeah, we can see it. So just, you can go ahead and start, Mike.
Maybe I'll reduce those and make this better. It won't have the animations that make it easier to present it, but I'll just go ahead and go through it.
Okay.
Okay, so this is a presentation of the financial sustainability analysis that we did for the city. I'm the one of the executive vice presidents, and Will Carr, who worked with me on this, is one of our managers who's done a good bit of this work with me also. I'm going to talk to you about what planning for financial sustainability is, and about the modeling that we did for you, and review the interactive model, the results of the model, and go through the results of the overall recommendations. The general fund must generate sufficient fund revenues to be financially sustainable. However, today there's a great bit of uncertainty in not only the U.S. and the world, but in terms of record inflation, supply chain shortages, local government funding limitations. And these things are fungible, they change. We're really not sure where they're going to be, so we're trying to make assumptions about where these things like inflation and availability of the things that you need are going to go into the future. The general fund must run like a self-supporting business. Financial sustainability forecasting is a cash-based analysis where all revenues and costs included in the analysis are in cash. It's different from your financial statements, which are accrual-based. So this is cash, much like managing your personal finances. We're looking at cash in versus cash out, and fund balance, and how those different cash flows affect fund balance as you move into the future. It basically overlays your annual budgeting process with a long-term vision as to the consequences of current budget decisions. And the objective is to provide the level of service that your community expects while ensuring that your general fund is financially sustainable into the future. When you develop a financial plan, you have cost increases, which are primarily driven by staffing needs, inflationary cost increases, and capital projects. Your revenues are based upon taxes and other revenues of the general fund, and your financial policies help guide the balancing process that ends up with a multi-year financial plan. What is financial sustainability? The primary measure of financial sustainability is unassigned fund balance. It's, like I said before, it's a little bit like managing your personal finances. If you spend more than you make, it's going to affect your savings. Your savings have to be reduced. If you make more than your spend, you can increase your savings account. So if cash out exceeds cash in, if you have deficit spending, the deficit must come from unassigned fund balance. As long as the unassigned fund balance is high enough, the cash flow deficit can be funded, although it will decrease the fund balance by the amount of the deficit spending. However, if the deficit spending continues, the unassigned fund balance may ultimately fall below your minimum fund balance target and could be depleted completely if the cumulative annual deficit spending is large enough. This projected condition will require actions to ensure that the fund balance is kept at the minimum target level. In the financial model that we developed for you, we identified these trends and evaluate actions to be taken to ensure that the unassigned fund balance is at or above the minimum fund balance target throughout the projection period. The interactive modeling tool and process that we use allows us to provide transparency with stakeholders, paint the full picture of your general fund's financial situation over a 5-year forecast and a 10-year projection, and evaluate potential changes to your current situation, such as staffing needs, capital projects, regulatory compliance, etc. And to identify any needed annual tax rate adjustments to gain employee and constituent acceptance of the financial sustainability plan, and finally to obtain the approval of you, the city's governing body. So what's included and what's not included? What's included in the plan are it's looking at the general fund, and it includes the equipment reserve fund. It includes contributions from the general fund to the equipment reserve fund in FY24 of $550,000, and then in subsequent years of $600,000 per year. What's not included, we did not include the facility maintenance reserve because there are no scheduled contributions for the general fund to that reserve. It does not include debt proceeds on hand because those are earmarked for the library project and any excess capital needs would be funded from the ARPA funds if there's not enough debt proceeds on hand to fund the entire capital needs that were anticipated to be funded by those debt proceeds. It does not include self-contained funds with no regular interaction with the general fund, such as the federal ARPA fund, the speed camera fund, the special revenue fund, or the stormwater fund. So it's isolated totally, strictly on the general fund. A little bit different than what your financial advisor showed you today, which was the city as a whole, and he did break out the different funds in some of his slides, but this is strictly on the general fund. The major assumptions in the model, if you just look at the little gray areas there, the total growth in taxable property value is about 4% a year going forward, and that's a prediction. It could be higher, it could be lower. It's one of the things that we can sometimes test the sensitivity to. The other revenues, the growth in income taxes, we've assumed it will be about 2.6% a year. And then the next gray line on line 11 is the average annual growth in intergovernmental revenues. And that's the weighted average of the white lines above it, the intergovernmental in lieu of police, the cable fees, and the growth in all of our intergovernmental funds. And it averages just about 0.34% a year. The growth in real property taxes, we're assuming they're going to be at about 4% a year. You had a pretty good bump in 24 from the property tax assessor's office, but we're assuming about a 4% increase going forward into future years. The overall assumed growth in other revenues, which are primarily fees and licenses, is a slight decrease in 24, but then we're assuming about a little over a 2% increase in every year going forward. We're assuming operating expenses will increase, the personnel will increase at 3% a year, and all other operating expenses will increase at 4% a year for the next 2 years, and then 3% for the years thereafter. We got your capital improvement program from you in current year dollars, so we're assuming that those project dollars will increase by about 3% per year when we're going out into the future years over the term of the forecast. The major assumptions in the model are on line 1 that the property tax rate per $100 of taxable value you already adopted an increase from FY23, where it went from 0.5397 to 0.5522, and we're assuming that will hold constant for the remainder of the period. On line 2, the city has been maintaining a minimum assigned reserve fund balance of about $3 million, which is below the Governmental Finance Officers Association recommendation in industry practice, which is 2 months of operating expenses or revenues. Therefore, in order to come into compliance with the GFOA and industry practice, the minimum unassigned fund balance target in our model is ramped up from 10% of revenues in FY22, which is about the $3 million, to 17% of revenues by FY23, which gets you up to the 2% of revenues or operating expenses by the end of the 10-year projection period. On item 3 there, it's assumed that the execution rate for the CIP will be 100% in FY23 and 24, and FY23 is basically baked in, but by the time you get into FY25, we believe that you will execute capital at a lower percentage, at about 80% of the budgeted amount. This is typically realized by most government organizations, and it's caused by a number of factors, which can include permitting delays, weather delays, procurement delays, staff shortages, and just changing your plans with regard to the overall capital improvement program. In item 4, it was determined that a reduction in let me just step back a second. One of the principles that we got direction from city staff on was that you would have no new borrowing in the forecast period. So it was determined in order to achieve that, a reduction in 27 and 28 of 2.6%, not cumulatively, 2.6 in 27, and then that continues over into 2028, and a reduction of about 0.61% from the projected budgets in each year from 29 to 30 will maintain the unassigned reserve fund balance at or above the minimum target level in each year, and it would avoid the need for borrowing to fund the CIP in each year of the projection period. These adjustments remain throughout the projection period. The results of the analysis are our recommendations were to continue with the property tax rate for real property of 0.5522 per $100 of property value that was adopted in 24 and maintain that throughout each year in the forecast period. The second recommendation is to adopt a policy to ramp up the minimum unassigned balance from $3 million in 24 to 17% of revenues in FY23 to comply with the FGOA recommendation. The third bullet is to adjust the capital expenditures as follows: to execute the capital budget at 100% of the budget in FY23 and in 24, and to reduce execution of the capital budget to 80% of the budget in FY25 through 26 through FY25-26 through FY27-28, and to adjust the operation and maintenance expense to 94% of the projected budget amount in each year, as projected based upon the FY24 budget for all years in the forecast period. This was based upon an evaluation of your actual versus projected, your budgeted versus actual results for the past several years, and it basically, and I think Susan alluded to that in some of her comments, that your actual results have been reasonably, considerably less, in the range of about 94% of your budgeted amount. And that's due to vacancies and other factors that would cause you to spend less money than you actually budget. Again, to reduce the O&M expenses, as I indicated, to avoid the need for borrowing in 2007, in FY27 and 28. In FY27 and 28, we recommend re-examining the potential to increase the O&M expenses from this reduced level to a higher level to 28-29. The last recommendation is to review this financial sustainability analysis at a minimum of every 3 years to make adjustments as events occur differently than projected. However, when I was listening to the presentation by your financial advisors, it looks like that in 2023, you actually had considerably better results in terms of cash flow than possibly what we projected in here, because we used your budget amount in 23 and we used it at 94% of the budget amount. But we did use your capital dollars at 100%, and it sounded like that those may have been reduced some. And also some of your fund balance decisions in terms of freeing up some restricted reserves may have caused the fund balance to be a little bit better. So I actually would recommend that you look at this next year, because it may be that you have better results going forward than what we projected here. But for sure, in 26, we think you should look at it then to see whether you still need to reduce your O&M expenses in future years, because you may not actually need to do that. Although the modeling that we have performed included a 10-year projection of revenues, expenses, and fund balance, we also provided a financial forecast that included the first 5 years of those projections. The 5 years is representative more of a planning period, whereas projections for years 6 through 10 are less reliable, because actual results can vary from projections that far into the future. The further into the future you get, the more likely there is to be variance is from what the projections that were assumed, the assumptions that were assumed that made those projections. A graphical presentation of the forecast results is printed on this page, and let's see if I can make that a little bit bigger. The upper left graph shows that cash flow is positive for FY24, which is reflected in an increase in fund balance in FY24 in the upper right graph. That's the black line here, showing an increase in cash flow where the cash in exceeds the cash out, and therefore your fund balance increases in those years. The upper left graph shows a negative cash flow after the cash funding of a number of capital projects in 26, right there, which is reflected in a reduction in fund balance in 26 in your upper right graph right here. The upper left graph shows that cash flow turns positive in 28, the difference between the green and the red lines there, which is reflected in a beginning an increase in the fund balance in the subsequent year. So you can see that your fund balance with the plan that we are recommending that you adopt stays at or above the minimum fund balance. And the trend is that as you're going into future years, it would maintain a level at or slightly above that also. This is a summary forecast a summary of the forecast results. And you can see it shows operating revenue here, total revenue, total expenditures, net income. And the key thing here is fund balance. The ending year unassigned fund balance, you can see in these lines here. And that's compared to the minimum unassigned fund balance requirement that is increasing in each year, as we indicated, to get up to the GFOA recommendation. And as you can see, the excess or deficit in the unassigned fund balance is you have an excess in all years. You have a very slight deficit in FY26, which is immaterial for this analysis. And then it begins to get a slight excess as you go out in 28. And when you go out into the future years and the projections, that excess begins to get slightly better. So that's the end of my formal presentation, but I'd be happy to answer any questions if anybody has anything they'd like to look at or may explain a little bit further.
Great, thank you so much. Councilmember Small?
Yes, I wanted to say how appreciative I am, Michael, of this effort on your guys' part. I think it's really clear. The only request that I would have about it would be if, on the back of the report has your table 4 graphs, like slide 19. If we could get those independent and so they were on a page apiece or something for long-term understanding, that would be the only change that I would request. And I think that having a hard number or theoretical hard numbers that are soft as goals or constraints is not unlike things that previous councils have done that have constrained us. And so it is at least something that we can at least consider as we move forward, whereby we are trying to hit the number regardless of whether or not the constant yield rate comes in at X, Y, or Z. I think probably for someone who likes numbers, that would seem like a good idea. And so I was wondering about how, what your experience is post these kinds of conclusions with how municipalities implement these ideas.
Well, can you still hear me okay? Yes.
Yes.
Thanks for your comments, Councilmember. You brought up a couple of things. One was about the report. Could you repeat? I don't know if you're still seeing my screen or not where I'm in my report. Can you see it, or is my screen still on the PowerPoint?
Yes. Yeah, and so I'm talking about slide 19 of
slide 19.
Yeah, of your presentation.
Of this slide.
Yes, all of those things, because they have the arrows next to them and whatnot. If we could just get that in sort of a different form, I would just appreciate it, just because it would help with clarity's sake. But that's only just because it would help with clarity's sake. It's not like the information is unclear. It's just a presentation thing.
If this was in the show mode, you wouldn't see all those lines at once. It would just bring in the black lines with this one, and it would go away.
Okay, that makes sense. Well, I'm not trying to salt your game or harsh your mellow.
No, I understand. I mean, if we could just eliminate those lines, if that would make it clear, would that make it clear if we did that?
Either way, if you made them different slides or something and I'm not trying to make you do it on the fly. It's just for the explanation's sake. I'm more interested in the actual in your professional experience, what have municipalities done with information once this has occurred?
Well, most of the clients that I've worked with over the years, and there's been quite a few, they redo this analysis if not every year, every other year. A number of my clients, Fort Lauderdale was one, a big client, they just kind of adopted it as an extension of their budgeting process. It isn't a budgeting process, don't get me wrong, but it takes your budget and then it gives a forward look to your budget. And so a number of my clients have done that. And the cost of doing that is not as much as the cost of doing the initial study, because the model's already there and you can rerun it. Some of them do it every 2 years instead of every year, but it just depends on how sensitive things are. One of the issues that we have when we do these studies, we did this back in the spring and early, before you had moved into the fiscal year that you are now. We did not know, we did not have an audit. We didn't know the actual results for FY23. So we used the FY23 budget. In each year that you update this, you have better actual data to kind of make the model a little bit better as you move it forward. So it just depends on you and your comfort level with how you believe the projections are and what you would need to do. I believe we talked to staff about doing this about no longer than every third year, given that we're predicting you might need to reduce your O&M expenses in 28, in 2027, 28. You might want to do this 1 year earlier than that, but my experience has been that it is a little bit all over the field. We've had 1 or 2 clients that really have never updated it, but almost all of my clients update it every year, every other year, and maybe there's 1 or 2 that do every third year.
So then I guess the last part of that I would say before I defer to someone else is that, so we are talking essentially about the idea of having some knowledge of where we are and what we would like to do at the same time as, like, even over time, over a 3-year basis, even as we have the fluctuations of individual budgets in the process.
Great. So I'm going to kind of jump the line because I do just want to kind of pick up one little nugget. So, and I'm very appreciative that we've had these series of discussions in a row because they do feed off of one another. So in the first presentation with the actuals for 23, we learned that we don't execute 100% of our budget. So I would be interested in knowing, how far off we are from some of the execution assumptions that's included here, because, the reason why, we're kind of, air quotes, flat, $560,000 or so off. But it is a true testament to the fact that we don't execute 100%. I would even beg to question whether even it's 96%. It's probably in the 80s, right, in terms of the proportion of our budget that we actually execute. And so I do think that it might be helpful for us to start looking at, because there is such a big difference between what we budget for and then what we actually accomplish, and what is a real proxy for what our execution rates are in a given year. And I think that might also help us with really honing in on some of the assumptions that we would use something like this to help foster.
That's smart. That's smart.
That's true. And what, Councilmember, when we, I don't mean to interrupt you, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, go right ahead, go ahead. No worries.
When we looked at budget versus actual, there were some years that were down in the 90, 91%. And we actually picked the highest execution. So you are right, it could be lower. And I know there's lots of reasons for that. But the reason we include this in our analysis is we don't believe that it would make sense to plan for expenses that you really aren't realistically going to incur. But I think you're right on about your comments.
Yeah, and I agree with that. But I do think that it begs to question, especially if we are in terms of how do we kind of right ship. There's a couple ways we can tax our way out of it, or we can reduce our expenditures out of it. And we can make our budget be a little bit more in line with what we can feasibly accomplish, but giving ourselves enough wiggle room in case stuff pops off, right? So that's why this whole presentation has just gotten me to thinking about, especially because of some of the assumptions that we have to make in order to get these forecasts, some different ways in which we may want to start considering budget in the future. Councilmember DeBala?
Yes, thank you. Following up on that, I have questions in 3 areas. And the first one, going back to looking at the presentations before this one, which were about all of the funds, and then at this one. So when you're talking about and recommending a level of unreserved funds and a minimum unassigned fund balance, are you talking the 17% is just for the general fund?
Well, in this analysis, it is. Yeah,
Okay.
all we're looking at is a general fund fund balance and the unrestricted reserve.
So that's one of the application questions that I have for the council. Is it 17% for every fund, or is it 17% overall?
I think legally it's only back, like for the
Overall.
No, I think it's just for the general.
Well, so that would be something that I'd like to get clarified, because I am not sure either.
Yeah, I don't know.
And what we saw in the actual
Hi,
results
Susan.
that Susan presented earlier, it looked like all of the funds together.
Councilman, the
forgot you were there.
17% of our general fund revenue is actually our city's reserve policy. And this reserve policy mainly is targeted at our unassigned reserve. We have so many different kind of reserve, and our total fund balance is about 20 million, but 8 million is right now in our unassigned reserve because of some transfer release from the restricted bond fund, and also some from our committed reserve, because we have an improved, budgeting year in '24. The deficit amount has dramatically reduced to 1.2 million. So that's why we are releasing some of the committed reserve to the unassigned. So it's a better result than any other year, because we have a higher balance in our unassigned reserve.
Of the general fund.
Of the general fund.
Because our
And-
policy says 17%
Yeah.
of the general fund. And the GFAO policy is also only for general fund?
It's, they are talking about 2 months' worth
2
of
months.
our operating funds.
Which is the general fund?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
It-
exactly.
It is talking about the general fund. You have what's that one you have? The stormwater fund, is that what it is?
Mhm.
Or solid waste? I mean, we do that kind of work too, and when you're looking at those kinds of funds, like a stormwater fund, for instance, you may want to be looking at more. I mean, it just depends. You might want to look at 3 months of operations and maintenance expenses. And I'd have to go back and check to see if the GFOA has recommendations for those types of enterprise funds. But what we were talking about was just for the general fund to keep 2 months of, the equivalent to 2 months of revenue in your fund balance for your unrestricted reserves.
Right.
And just to, I hate to
Keep going.
jump in, but just as a reminder for folks, this was something that was discussed as part of the council priorities, where we had talked about the fact that we do have a policy where we do strive to have up to 17% of our funds available in the unassigned general fund balance reserve, general fund reserve. But there were other reserves that don't have similar policies. So things like equipment replacement reserve and some of our other funds where we don't have similar reserve policies. And so that was something that was noted in our priorities when we were talking about fiscal government. and fiscal management. And so I do just want to make sure that folks are aware that that was something that was brought up as part of the council priorities, is something that we would need to take a look at.
Okay,
If I may point one other thing out, the end of year FY22 balance is, I think it's 4.8 some odd $1 million. I checked the numbers in my model against what your financial advisor was presenting, and it matched his numbers. But it has a good bit of restricted reserves and designated reserves for projects. But in either his comments or Susan's comments, they indicated that in 23 you released some of those restrictions. So if we were to look at this now and we knew what you did in 23, we might have that beginning balance in 23 might be higher than this because it has some of the restrictions removed. So one of the reasons it might be helpful to look at this on a more frequent basis would be you can accommodate situations like that that we didn't know was going to happen when we were doing this back in the spring of 23, but it turned out that it did happen, and it would potentially affect the results in terms of these fund balances.
Okay, so second and third question. Second question, if I recall, in last March, you were able to run a couple extra scenarios. That's not an option this time. Okay, thank you. Third set of questions, just to suggest to the group that, following up on what the mayor said, that some of the global assumptions also seem a little off to me. I'm looking at the last 10 years of real property tax totals and trying to look at whether the growth is 4% or if it's considerably higher or lower. Same thing for growth in some of the in some of the other revenues. 0 over time. I don't know. I wonder about some of these assumptions, but I do want to say in closing that I think this is so helpful to see all of these pieces together and see the assumptions behind them, so that we can get a better handle on what the longer term impacts are of the decisions we make about the budget every year. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you for your comments. And I might mention that we try to be conservative. When we look back at the growth in property values, we probably could have had a higher number. But the last thing we want is for us to have numbers that when the real things occur and they don't occur as projected, that it causes you a problem. I would much rather have it cause you to have a good problem if we get more growth in assessed values going forward.
Yeah,
So,
I appreciate the conservativeness of the assumptions. Thank you.
One thing, when we don't have the model up right now, but when we were running the model in a number of the staff sessions, and even when I was there the first time with you, we can look at the sensitivity of those kind of things. We can say, well, what happens if property values do increase at 5% instead of 4%? And then it reflects itself in those graphs that you saw on the last, on graph 19. And so those are the kind of things that you can test as you go forward when you look at this on an annual or a biannual or every third year basis.
Okay, great, thank you.
Okay, sorry, just as a quick note for colleagues, we are at the 2-minute mark. Councilmember Honzak.
Okay, just quickly, I guess I'm just going to follow on about the assumptions. The things where I noticed some challenges I thought with the assumptions might relate to personnel costs, which I know comprises the largest part of our budget. I see it's only 3% rise each year, and that doesn't align necessarily with what I would imagine. I would be putting in maybe 4 to 5%, partially based on high inflation rates right now. And that seems like it's going to persist. And then also our cable fees have been going down. And I don't know how substantial that is, but am I right? Yeah. So, and I don't know if that could be fit into the model in the future. Thanks.
Correct. The cable fee, as what we were told by the cable manager from Montgomery County, we were told the estimate from year to another year is always a 7% reduction because of the reduced use of the cable. A lot of people are doing streaming and, the other type of entertainment service instead of enrolling in cable services. So that's why that makes our cable revenue reduced.
And it just stays at a static -7 each year? That's the presumption?
It's a constant number that got
Okay.
reduced from one year to another, is estimated to be 7% reduction.
Okay.
Councilmember Gibson?
Yeah, well, just one quick point. A longer conversation I'd like to have with David and staff in terms of this is stiff medicine. No matter how we change it slightly based on what we did in this past year, but it's the implications of it are stiff and hard, and I think we really need to have some longer conversations. But that's for later, since we're tight. I wanted to ask about equipment reserve for Mike. What assumptions did you make on what would happen with our equipment reserve? ERR, I guess it's called.
They're right here. We assumed in FY '24 you'd have a $550,000 contribution from the general fund to that equipment reserve, and for the remaining years it'd be $600,000 a year. We did.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. I missed that.
We did monitor that and the projects that were to be funded by the equipment reserve. And then the out years, if you look at the 10-year forecast, for the last couple of 3 years, there were some projects that couldn't be funded. But we didn't make any adjustments to our projections because that's so far into the future that you may or may not have those projects still. And you may have a better results than what we projected here. You may have higher income coming into the general fund, and you may make a higher contribution over to that reserve fund to cover those projects. But for the 5-year forecast period, that fund is fully fundable. All its projects are fully fundable from that contribution that's from the general fund that you see there.
And so that's I guess those out year, there's beyond 5-year scenarios is what I was concerned about from I guess your previous presentation. But at $600,000 per year contributions from 25 through fiscal year 33, that sounds like a pretty significant contribution that I guess your sense is that that's adequate.
Well, I think it may be adequate. If you need to review this periodically, whether you do it every
absolutely.
2 years, every 3 years, and as you get closer to those out years, if it still appears that there's some unfunded projects in an equipment replacement reserve fund, then you can make adjustments at that point.
Thank
you
you,
can have
sir.
a higher contribution from the general fund to cover them. You may not need as many capital projects. Things may change. I mean, that's 8, 9, and 10 years out is when they'll show up in the last 3 years of the 10-year projection. So.
Okay, thank you, sir.
And they're not very large, really. They're less than $1 million.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I do want to pick up one thing with that Councilmember Gibson raised around the equipment replacement reserve. And I think one of the things that's important to keep in mind is the juxtaposition of that reserve fund versus the CIP, right? So it's the CIP, the capital, So what we put in that ERR is kind of us trying to proactively plan for different projects that we may, or equipment and things that we may need as part of, different types of projects. So I do think that we need to make sure that we're planning ahead, right? So trying to think through how all of these different pieces fit together is difficult, and I'm grateful that we've hired the folks that have been here today and provided these presentations to help us with kind of thinking through all of this, because I think each presentation that we've heard today warrants some additional thought and some creativity and potentially some policy making in order to solidify a path forward in terms of our fiscal outlook. So thank you again for coming out tonight. And I think I don't see any more lights on this presentation. I am already being moved to go ahead and close the meeting. And I have a second. All right, well, thank you so much, Michael, for joining us tonight. And I am going to say this meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.